Okay. Hello, everybody. I warmly welcome you to today's Esports Research Colloquium. And this colloquium should provide a forum for knowledge exchange, networking, and discussing ideas. Please notice that this colloquium will be recorded. And if you don't want to appear in the recording, but you want to take part in discussing your ideas, please feel free to use the chat so that I can forward your questions and or your feedback to the speaker. Without wasting any time, I'd like to introduce Mark Campbell. In 2006, he got a PhD in psychology from the University College of Dublin with a thesis entitled An Empirical Investigation of Expertise in Golf Putting and Green Reading. Currently, Mark is a lecturer at the Physical Education and Sports Science Department in Sport, Exercise and Performance Psychology at University of Limerick. He is a Science Foundation Ireland funded investigator and principal investigator on a project which seeks to derive and evaluate the key performance indicators in computer gaming and esports. In addition, as you can see on his screen right now, he's a member of LERO, the Irish Software Research Center, and the goal of his research is to gain a greater understanding of cognitive and perceptual processes underlying skilled movements and how these skills can be applied to different populations. In doing so, Mark has utilized different technologies such as eye tracking, NIRS, and EEGs. Now I'm looking forward to his presentation on the effect of expertise, training, and neurostimulation on sensory motor skills in esports. Stage is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Ollie. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. It's a pleasure to be here, so thanks very much for the invite. Title of my talk today is The Effect of Expertise, Training and Neurostimulation on Sensory Motor Skill in Esports. So before we get into the details of it, I suppose I'd like to maybe introduce you to our lab here at the University of Limerick in Ireland. Our approach to work, our team, you know, the types of research we're interested in, where we're publishing in, and so on. I suppose it's important to do this because, you know, we're very open to collaboration. We're very open to working with other people. We work with an industry partner, Logitech, as you might know, or as you know now, with the big logo at the bottom. They part funded the research lab originally, stemming all the way back to 2016, and we have some research contracts with them for the next 3 years, so it'll be an 8-year relationship by the end of it. So our lab at the moment is a team of 8. It's a multidisciplinary team. We have computer science, we have psychology, we have software, we've got data analytics, neuroscience, biomechanics, and I suppose more generally speaking, sports science. And we have a research fellow here, Dr. Adam Toth. We have a postdoc in software and coding. We've got 3 RAs who are from a psychology background, but are, I suppose, they're data analysts as well as kind of, they're quantitatively kind of driven. We've a computer science professor, Conor Ryan, who would kind of input into our project in terms of AI or machine learning or things like that. We have a PhD student, Tim Smithies, and we're hiring a new RA soon for a new project we're doing, looking at the effect of peripherals on esports performance. So we're looking at mouse weight, click force, friction, and so on. So if you're interested, or if anyone is interested, please get in touch, and I'm happy to give you some more details about that as well. So we're set up. Oh, hang on.
It's working now. Sorry.
It's working now. Perfect. Okay. So our publications to date were set up in 2016, so it took us a while to get going. You know, we were set up with Logitech, and we were looking at this idea of deriving and evaluating key performance indicators for esports. So we wanted to look at, you know, cognitive athletes. My background, as Ollie said there, is in cognitive sports psychology. So we were interested in, you know, just how cognitive esports athletes were they superior? Did they have a superior profile? There was some research out there to show that they were cognitively enhanced or cognitively better, but some of the research wasn't of a brilliant standard, let's just say. So we wanted to make sure of that ourselves, and we wanted to see. So some of our early work was looking at neurocognition of gamers on standard tests of cognition, and we found some interesting results. Some of our other lab members are interested in sleep and cognitive performance. So we see a sleep and cognitive performance publication here. And we've had a few kind of COVID projects as well. So we've looked at boosting, cheating, life after esports, and so on. And our latest publication is coming out next week, which again is our research assistant, Magda Koval, is particularly interested in the effects of gaming on mental health. So it's a kind of a looking at freely available commercial video games and how they can beneficially impact on mental health. So check that out as well, if you like. Okay, so Red Bull Gaming produced this kind of graphic around 2016 or 2015. We came across it then anyway. And it kind of helped to inform us very early days about what was going on with esports athletes. So what makes an e-athlete? Is it, you know, a biometric advantage that they have, heart rate variability, stress, sleep, etc.? Is it a physical advantage, reaction time, and so on? Is it this idea of technological integration? So, you know, are they just digitally, you know, savvy? And is it, you know, aspects around that? Or is it a neuro or neurocognitive advantage, or just a pure skill advantage? So this kind of helped to inform our early thinking and helped us to think about how could we measure expertise in esports. I think it's a real challenge when we try to measure team sports individually, because some of those metrics are very clear and very easy, kill death ratios and so on. But some of them are less clear because they play an opponent, they have, you know, better AI and better, you know, games, you know, that kind of matchmaking and so on. So how do we actually do that? And for us, we needed to think about how we could separate out the individual esports skills. Could we separate them out? Could we measure them? Could we quantify them? And then could we put them back into a game or a game type situation? So this is kind of what we came up with here. We wanted to see, you know, there's a visual perceptual element of gaming. There's a cognitive side of it. We've recently published around the physical side of it. So the effect of exercise on cognition, the effect of exercise for gamers and cognition, what aspects are, you know, impacted the most. The technical, the biomechanics side, I think, is a really, really under-researched side of esports. I think there's a huge opening here. We're starting to do a little bit in this area, but there's a huge gap in terms of, you know, looking at the effects of technical skills and biomechanical skills, and, you know, even performing a flick or a movement and so on. Is there a correct way to do it, an incorrect way to do it? And then obviously there's the peripheral itself, sensitivity, DPI, and so on. Mental skills and nutrition and so on. So this was our kind of bigger, broadened out look at gaming performance and what we thought might be interesting here. So as I said, our early work looked at mainstream cognitive tests. We looked at trail making and Stroop, which are nice, widely available measures of cognitive control and cognitive inhibition and things like that. And we found some really nice clean results between action video game players, so first-person shooters and MOBAs, and they had superior processing speed, they had superior task switching ability, they were faster for trials requiring cognitive control. So this was back in 2018. So well, we did that study, published that, and then we wanted to look at, I suppose we got a bit greedy, or we got a bit more interested in this. We said, let's have a look at expertise differences. Let's have a look at just CSGO players. Can we differentiate non-CSGO players, low skill, intermediate, and elite skill in terms of Stroop? So in terms of their ability to inhibit one thing to do another. So this idea of cognitive flexibility. And we didn't actually find the differences which we thought we might find. We found little trends, but they didn't differentiate themselves in terms of their cognitive inhibition. So esports athletes are definitely cognitive athletes. They definitely have a superior profile, but when we try to differentiate between expertise within them, the picture becomes a little less clear. So from here, we wanted to move on to maybe this idea of quantifying performance. And, you know, when we looked at esports at the time, it might be a little bit different now. I'm sure there's some, I see some guys who work with some teams now and things like that, but a lot of their practice was game-based practice. It was just scrims, more scrims, and even more scrims, and it was hours and hours and hours. It was really this not smart approach to practice, you know, and at the time we were probably learning about Ericsson and 10,000 hours of practice, and I suppose a lot of that was really misinterpreted into this idea of it's probably the type of training you do and not the amount that seems to matter. So a really kind of seminal study that came out around this time was by Walter Boot. I'm sure some of you might have come across this before. Walter Boot and Arthur Kramer. They looked at this idea of variable priority training, and FET stands for full immersion training. And they designed a game called Space Fortress. You might have come across it. So they're two cognitive psychologists. They designed their own game, and within this game of Space Fortress, they could play the full game in its entirety. So they could do the full immersion training side of it to try to win or get to some sort of endpoint. Or within the game, they could do variable priority training. In other words, they could separate out individual skills within this game that were important, and they could train them in isolation. And really interestingly, obviously, what they found here was that people improved, accelerated their skills and their performance on Space Fortress, the game, when they did variable priority training over and above when they just played the game, when they did the scrim version of the game. Now this was a really groundbreaking study for us here in the lab. We really liked it, and it really appealed to us because it was about the type of training that they did. So we knew from sports science, obviously, we knew from other sports that the type of training is just, it's a given. You know, you play golf, you do certain types of technical drills. You might practice a certain swing or a certain type of shot. For soccer, you might do dribbling, or you might do shooting and passing. But for esports, around that time, it was all very much gaining the motor memory for the maps you were doing, gaining the knowledge, the game knowledge, what you were doing. It was less around technical abilities and isolating them out. So this we thought was a big area to be explored. So what we did was we're based here in the Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Software Research. So if we didn't do any software research, we'd be in trouble, obviously. So, you know, we wanted to look at software tests that could isolate and measure individual esports skills. So we went to PAX in 2016 of gamers, and we built up a picture of what the really important skills were for gaming, and then we tried to design software tests to measure these aspects, and we call them GATES eventually, gaming ability based tests for esports. Here's what they looked like at the start. So October 2016, we wanted to keep these as ungamified as possible. We didn't want them to look like Overwatch or CSGO or League of Legends or anything like that. We wanted them to be kind of clinical and just actually measure what we wanted them to measure. We failed miserably, obviously. By 2018, we were making them look very gamified and so on. But I think we needed to do that even just for kind of user engagement and so on as well. But we started building in a training arena, baseline test, feedback or coaching tests, so to give you results and to give you real-time results and so on. So this is kind of, I just want to bring you through the software element of this things, and then you can see how this fed into our study for today. So as you can see, they look like complete shit at the start. What we had here was we had a speed versus economy game. So you had to click on the small targets to get more points, or the bigger targets to get less points. So we wanted to see, could people use their mouse and click on what kind of strategies would they use? We also had something called temporal recognition. Can we pay attention to one aspect and be aware temporally of what's happening in the periphery? Again, peripheral vision. So we get participants to do some sort of a central task, and then these side tasks would light up. Could they be aware of that? How quickly could they react to that? So these were some of the tests we were designing at the time. Keyboard reaction time here, absolutely awful version on the left. Eventually we got it into a keyboard type of a configuration, which it would be a, you know, first person shooter type setup. Then we started to give them their results screens. So here's what their results screens look like. So here's how you did, here's what the pros do, and here's a leaderboard of all the people who've ever done this test. and it gave you kind of strengths and weaknesses and so on. So we were trying to build in a kind of a feedback or a coaching element to the software so people could see how they were doing and how they were doing against other people. We then started to go into 3D. So all this was done in Unreal Engine, utilizing kind of C++. And we started looking at 3D environments, time on target. Can you hover over the ball for as long as you can while it's dynamically moving around an environment or a man running around? And we give them results on this as well. And we moved on then into kind of first-person shooters. So we wanted to look at strafing and spraying and things like that. So could you hit the opponent while running between walls before you got hit yourself? Could you manage your spray control outside of, with an automatic weapon, or could you, learn to do that and so on? So this was to hit a moving target a number of times while controlling your spray. So in other words, if you didn't control your spray, you would score much lower. So these were the tests we were designing, and we had about 14 or 15 working versions of these, and we wanted to see, can we train people up in these skills, and will this have a beneficial effect in terms of their ability to do this one skill, and then will this transfer into game? So all of these tests, they turned into what's now known as Playmaster, and Logitech now run Playmaster, but the idea behind our tests and our software was we wanted to design individual tests that we could feed back to people. And we wanted to supply the science behind it, training, coaching, skill tests. Are they valid, reliable, and robust? The Playmaster beta or advanced beta version as it is now looks a lot better than our original tests. We've a nice warm-up area, challenges, baseline tests, and so on. Here's a nice example of AVP training. So again, you might have a countdown to a certain point, and then you have a target appear, and you have to flick to that target and so on. And then the feedback it gives you is, so the skills you'll see here are hold, track, shoot, peek, spray, move, perceive, and flick. And it gives you your score versus the community who have done these tests on Playmaster, and then maybe you might compare it to pros as well. And then it gives you your strengths and some of your weaknesses. So things to work on. So it's a really useful tool for gamers. And I think some of you here might have tried it already. If you haven't, you should probably check it out. I know they have big plans for moving it forward too. So, okay, there's my Playmaster plug. All right. So if we think about performing a skill then, so if we just bring it right back a second and we think about performing a skill or motor learning, and if we think about it in the context of gaming or shooting a basketball, there is an element of memory associated with this task. Okay, so we have this part of our brain pretty much dedicated to memory. And then what we do is we have some sort of a motor program where the action is now being encoded. So we have this kind of feedback loop where we create the action. We get sensory feedback from that, so visual or feel based or whatever it might be. And then we are either successful or unsuccessful at that task. And then this feedback loop is kind of complete or keeps going. So if we're interested in performing a skill, we're interested in this idea of motor memory, the action that they do, the feedback that they get, and so on. So if we think about that in the context of motor learning and this idea of a motor program, it might help you just as we move through the presentation, and as we were interested in brain stimulation then. So obviously later on we wanted to stimulate this part of the brain which is associated with action and movement with hands and fingers. So if we think about quantifying performance, we wanted to move beyond this idea of the kill-death ratio. We wanted to think, what is it, the skills that are important for gaming? It has to be more than just your kill-death ratio or not dying or whatever it might be. So we wanted to see, could we identify the fundamental skills that might differentiate experts in esports, and in particular in Counter-Strike, because we were particularly interested in Counter-Strike because we had designed our tests outside of games and then we had applied it into Counter-Strike. And we wanted to look at this idea of flicking. We thought flicking might be a really, really fundamental skill for esports. Your ability to flick to a target, execute that shot, and flick to the next target or whatever it might be. So this video isn't playing. Oh, there it is. Okay. So if you want to improve your shooting skills, you have to train flicking, okay? So we want to train flicking in the Playmaster alpha version or beta version or whatever it was at the time. And we wanted to see, could we improve people's ability to flick and how would that impact on their gaming performance? So we brought it one step further this time. So we thought, we have tdcs devices available to us here. We have background in psychology and neuroscience. Can we run a small electric current over the M1, the primary motor cortex, which will enhance the excitability of the neurons underlying movement with fingers and hands in particular? And if we can do that, can we accelerate or speed up or prime the learning which might happen here? Because there is evidence that this is the case in simple sensory motor tasks such as pointing. And there is evidence for it in, learning musical instruments and so on. So we wanted to look at it in terms of a complex sensory motor skill. And flicking with the mouse is a complex sensory motor skill. So we thought it would be an ideal area to do this and to have a look at the effect of training and then to have a look at, does TDCS actually enhance this further? Can we improve the strength of this link between memory and action? Okay. So we had 3 research questions then for this study. Does flick performance differ among non-gamers, low-skill gamers, and high-skill gamers? And apologies in advance, we should say lower skill CSGO gamers. I know some people are very put out by the definition of low skill in this study. How does development of this skill progress over time in gamers of different expertise? So we wanted to just not get them in for just one session in the lab. We wanted to have a look at them over the course of 8 days, 5 consecutive days of training in the lab, and then a retention test on the following Monday. So over 8 days. And then can brain stimulation or neurostimulation modulate the training effect? What's going to happen here when we do this with participants, and will it speed up their learning? So our 3 questions. Our methods then were non-gamers. They had to have no prior CSGO experience and they had to play less than 10 hours of non-AVG play per week on average. Our CSGO gamers, our lower skill bracket here, as you can see, incorporate some pretty decent skill ranges here, just under Grandmaster Guardian. So we had to do this just because if we wanted to segment it out any further, I think we would have had to have an awful lot more people in the study. We had 149 as it was. This is a monster study. This is one of these studies that you can only do every other year, maybe, because it is such a big undertaking. So I think that's worth the consideration. So I don't think it was lazy just to chop them into 2 groups, but I think these guys are definitely high skill. I don't think there's any question about that, but I think within the silver up to gold bracket is probably 2 groups in general, but I don't think for power and effect size and everything else, we just couldn't chop them down any further. It wasn't the way to go. And then we had a control group, and then we had our training groups, and I'll outline to you what those training groups look like now. So how does development of this skill progress over time in gamers of different expertise? The control group did Tetris for 10 minutes instead of the flicking training that the rest of them are doing. And sorry, they did it with their left hand as well, so, and not with a mouse, so it would just with the keyboard, because we wanted to keep the interference from using a mouse or using something along those lines separate out of that. For training then, this was our arena. We had bots or terrorists. They had 10 minutes to eliminate as many bots as possible. You had 1.5 seconds to kill each bot. We had to trial this out and pilot it and so on. We had to make it just challenging to be hard, but we didn't want it too short that people thought they were really crap at it. So we came up with this idea of a streak. You had 1.5 seconds to kill each bot. If you did it within 1.5 seconds, you kept a streak going, which tended to be very engaging for the gamers. And you had time to destroy, the total destroyed, the ammo used. You'd left, right, and center targets. and they were always within your field of view. So I think that's really important consideration for the study. They were never outside of your field of view. So they were always only within whatever 120 degrees or 180 degrees or whatever on your screen. So just we designed it that they could always see it, because we didn't want anything confounding the study, which is, well, I couldn't see the target. It was, you know, I moved my cursor such a way and the target was no longer visible. And then for the third, for the neurostimulation side of it, then what we wanted to do was we wanted to have a no-stim group who wore just a nice headset. We wanted a sham group who wore the Halo TDCS headset. It turned on, it ramped up, and then it turned off. And then this TDCS stim group, which got 20 minutes of stim over this M1 or motor cortex. This is what the devices look like. They have little nodules here which you would wet so they conduct the electrical current. It's very low current. If anyone has done it before, it's just like a little pinch, very low. And you prime these and you use a little salt-based solution to get them going. You run them off an app. So these are commercially available devices. They're FDA approved. They cost around $500 or $600. Halo have just been taken over by another company, so I don't think you can get them at the moment. But they're very easy to use, and we just needed to measure the size of the cortex. So we measured from the inion to the nasion, and we got the midpoint. So we had to do a little bit of that just to find out exactly where the M1 was on each participant. It was an anode, cathode, anode, so on. So if we use an anode type of current, we excite the neurons in the motor cortex. If we use a cathodal current, which we don't, it would inhibit those neurons in the M1 as well. So just to bear that in mind, because I think, you know, if you had future ideas for research, there's definitely ideas around stimulating the frontal lobe, which is where more cognitive capacities are located as opposed to motor capacities. So there's interesting areas even with TDCS or TACS or other aspects such as that. Okay, so they got 20 minutes of current. For the sham group, it ramped up for 1 minute and it ramped right back down again. And we wanted to check afterwards, do people think they got the stim or not? And we had some interesting results there. And for the other group, they had the stim for 20 minutes. And then they during this 20 minutes, they all did a crossword. Okay, so they weren't actually gaming. They weren't flicking at this point. We were just priming their brains before they did it. So they all did a crossword, which is meant to be cognitively engaging. So their cognition is firing away while they're doing it. And then immediately after their stim or their sham stim, they do the flicking training, which is 10 minutes long. Okay. So here's what the outlook of the study looked like. We had baseline tests at day one. So we did some various questionnaires. Some of the questionnaires we did were we controlled for mood, sleep, caffeine, etc. So we wanted to make sure that they didn't differ. So they had to come into the lab at the same time of the day, every day. They had to refrain from taking coffee or Monster or Red Bull or anything like that before they came in. We wanted to keep them all kind of in the same way across the 8 days of our study, so that we didn't have these confounders. Like I said, they did their STIM protocol with the crossword, and then they did 10 minutes of study. The control group did their Tetris. And then we had training day 2, training day 3, training day 4, and training day 5. And then immediately after training on day 5, they did the kind of baseline test again. And then on day 8, they came back, they did the questionnaires, they did the test again. So that's what it looked like. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. Okay, so here's some of our results then. So here's our lower skill and our higher skill. And the high skill participants, CSGO players, didn't report spending more time gaming compared to low skill participants. Okay, which is interesting, but we're trying to control for the amount of gaming they were doing over the course of the study. those with greater expertise played with the lower DPI, so eDPI sensitivity. They didn't differ across the experiment. So once they settled on a DPI, they didn't differ. Okay, I think that's important to note. So I think it was around 750 was their DPI on their mouse for on average or whatever it might be. And lower skill were slightly higher. And then the non-gamers or the novice gamers had a much higher DPI because they probably hadn't a clue about DPI and how it can be useful in flicking. Okay, so moving on to our results then, this idea, does flick performance differ among non-gamers, low skill and high skill? And absolutely it does. And we see really nice, clean, significant differences here across the targets and its number of targets destroyed. Okay, and then moving on to time to destroy. So how quickly they destroyed these targets. We see high skill were the quickest, low skill were next quickest, and non-gamers were the slowest. 1.78, 1.75 seconds versus 1.2 seconds to destroy targets on average. So quite a difference here. So CSGO gamers perform significantly better than non-gamers. High skill gamers perform significantly better than lower skilled gamers. And then when we look at center versus left targets versus right targets, we see very, very similar trends here. Maybe no difference in center targets for the two skilled groups, but definitely when they have to move left or move right to those targets. So when they have to incorporate that bigger movements, there was a difference here. So expertise differences across all target types. Okay. So we kind of tried to quantify this differences, you know, novice, expert, skill, performance, percentage differences, and it really is comparable to traditional sports, because I think all the time we sort of, maybe the barometer sometimes is, you know, how does this change compared to, you know, a change in another sport. And, you know, we just kind of quantified it here in terms of baseball, darts, golf, putting, and tennis shots, and it's very, very similar. It's not hugely different from some of the other ones. It's quite homogeneous there. Okay, so if we move on to our second aim then, is how does development of this skill progress over time in gamers of different expertise? So no brain stimulation yet. What does this development of this skill look like over the course of the week or the 8 days of training? And here's what the non-gamers look like here. So as you can see, by day 3, they have statistically significantly improved from their baseline. So 30 minutes of training on flicking is enough to improve their flicking performance statistically significantly. Same for our lower skill group. By day 3, they are significantly different from baseline and continued downwards over the next 2 days. And the high skill then obviously is one further day to see that improvement, even though they're starting from a lower area, aren't they? They're starting at 1.2 seconds, but they are reducing their times down over the 5 days. By day 4, so with 40 minutes of training, they are statistically significantly better than baseline. So really nice, clean results. We were really, really happy with these. And it was nice to be able to show that, you know, flicking does improve, flick training does improve their flicking. Our test, you know, was successful in that aspect. Non-gamers obviously saw the largest average improvement, and performance variance decreased with expertise, which we know to be the case in all other high performance arenas as well. All right. So now on to the kind of sexier stuff. So can neurostimulation modulate the training effect? So can we accelerate or speed up this training effect? And yes and no is the answer. Yes, for novice gamers, very much so. So the STIM group are the green group here. And for non-gamers, it's beautifully clean. We see this absolutely rapid acceleration in their time to destroy, in their time taken to destroy targets, than lower skilled or higher skilled groups. With the lower skilled group, we don't see a difference here, and with the higher skilled group, we don't see a difference here. They're improving, they're getting better, but the stimulation that they're getting is not over and above improving their motor learning, but it is for novice gamers. which is an interesting finding. And then it leads us to think, does TDCS not work for higher skilled gamers? And obviously we didn't find it here, but I think it would be interesting to look at it for longer, because we know the variability is much smaller when you have a skill, when you're at a certain skill level. The variability in performance is much smaller. So maybe you need a lot more time to tease out some of these differences. So that would be an area that we would consider looking at next, and so on. I'm happy to chat about that after as well. And if we look at it here in terms of other studies which have been done, this idea of TDCS over the motor cortex shows a much greater improvement curve than over sham or cerebellar and so on. So TDCS over the M1 tends to be a really nice area to stimulate, particularly for novices, because they do gain more from that kind of neural cascade that they get from the neurons being excited prior to doing the task. So there's something really interesting going on there. Okay, so if we look at the really interesting part for us now is if we look at the training effect for when people actually have to move. So if we're looking at a center target, there's very little mouse movement going on. Whereas if you have to flick right or flick left, you are actually moving. You're actually, doing what your motor cortex wants to do, which is probably move a little more. And we see lovely, clean results here for people who have to move to left targets, for people who have to move to right targets. So the actual movement side of it here. TDCS, so we had to conclude then that TDCS affected performance improvements for targets requiring greater motor control. So the more the motor control aspect was required, the more TDCS tended to benefit participants. So we concluded that TDCS was likely not due to placebo. So strapping on this headset and thinking that your brain's getting zapped, we don't think that was the case, because here's the people who perceived that they had the stim and the sham, and we see that a lot of people who had the sham thought they were getting the stim. And so on. So it was just a nice little manipulation check to do to make sure that they didn't all think they were getting the stimulation, which again will kind of highlight that getting a TDCS over your motor cortex isn't particularly very obvious. It's a very low current. It's very hard to tell unless you've been doing it for quite a while. The other aspect we did here is we tried to control for caffeine, and obviously we found that we could control really well for caffeine. People were good in terms of coming in and not having taken caffeine and so on. So there wasn't a difference across the conditions as well. So we had a good conclusion there as well. Okay. So what does it all mean? Why should we care? If we think about all we've done here is we've looked at flicking. We think flicking is a fundamentally super important skill for first-person shooters, obviously, absolutely. We can definitely conclude that flicking is important for CSGO performance. It would be lovely to look at in-game metrics now in terms of you do your flicking training, and then how does that translate into in-game performance improvements, or what would that look like? Would that just look like a better kill death ratio or something like that? It's hard to know with matchmaking and everything else that goes on, but it's definitely worth pursuing, and probably we should chat about that. It can be trained through deliberate block practice. I think that's really important. So a bit like a variable priority training, it can be trained through this block practice. And M1 or motor cortex TDCS can accelerate the training effect in novices or in early stage learners. And we think maybe in later stage learners, but it might have to be done over a longer time. But here's the disappointing part, or the great part about esports science at the moment. If we look at shooting skills, there's flicking, tapping, bursting, spray control, AVP, tracking. There's communication skills, which we haven't looked at yet. There was a nice tilt presentation here recently. There's emotional control, action, communication. And then there's movement skills, walking, running, cornering, checkdowns, crosshair placement, strafing, crouching, jumping, stopping before shooting. There's so many other aspects to optimal performance which need to be incorporated in. And immediately prior to the COVID lockdown #1, we were just about to roll out our second training study. So we were going to have 3 skills back to back. We were going to do 30 minutes of training, 10 minutes on each skill. We were going to try and quantify each of those 10-minute training blocks to see which one was more important. Flicking was going to stay there. And then we were going to choose 2 other skills which we thought were really important. COVID got in the way of that, and that's something which we're going to have to consider moving forward, whether to do that or whether to approach it in a slightly different way. So we're still a little bit open in terms of the possibilities there. But the nice part is now, I suppose, we do have Playmaster, or we do have access to Playmaster data, so we could look at people training from home. There's a little less experimental control. The nice part about our study was we got these 149 participants into the lab 5 days in a row and the following Monday. So we had great control over what they did. We scraped their Steam data if we needed to see if they were playing, control for all these other things. But obviously, if we wanted to make this bigger, we could broaden it out to at home type of people training. But obviously, we lose a little bit. What we gain in one area, we lose in another area. Okay, so what's next? For the lab, so obviously we're doing some FNIRS and EEG pilot testing at the moment. So FNIRS is functional near infrared spectroscopy. We have a portable FNIRS device, exact same as this here, so we can measure the oxygenation in various areas of the brain as people are gaming. So it's we think it's a really useful tool for looking at cognitive load, mental effort, areas implicated in gaming, in tilting, and all these other aspects. So we're starting to pilot test with FNIRS and with EEG, and we're hoping to kind of roll that out into an esports study over, well, probably starting next September at this rate, because the students are finishing up now, and we're going to pilot test for quite a while with this. So that's what's next for myself and Adam here in the lab. Obviously, we've a big research program going with other areas, which I'm happy to chat about too. But that is basically it for today. Just want to thank Ollie for the invitation and some of the members of the lab who helped with all this research as well. So thanks for your attention this morning, and happy to chat.
Thank you a lot, Mark, for your great presentation. I enjoyed the introduction into the software and the study design and the manipulation checks, as well as checking for confounding variables. It was a great presentation, and we already have 3 questions in the chat that I'd like to forward to you. Though the first one is there a risk that these tests would be used for talent identification for young gamers?
Yes.
And
yeah, well, I think so. I think you look at, I think if you look at the money involved in esports now, I think it's inevitable that it's going to move towards that kind of Premier League approach to identifying talent earlier and earlier, and tests that might be able to do that. Talent identification already happens, but it's just done through ranking and so on. So there is a risk that it will be used for that, but I think I'm not sure what we can do about aspects like that. I think gaming companies will always want to see if they can identify talent. They'll use various ways to do it. So if we have good tests which actually measure various skills, then I don't see it as being a harm in terms of them being able to identify the best people to flick or the best people to improve at a certain rate. I think that's quite a commendable thing in some ways, but yeah, I don't necessarily agree with talent identification issues around, identifying people very early.
Thank you. If this doesn't answer your question, just tell me, and then I will ask it in a different way. And the other question was, is it possible that game knowledge you need is much lower in Space Fortress than CSGO, and that is why BPT is working better?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. PPT works across a load of different areas actually. So Walter Boot and them, they've done quite a bit more on PPT in other aspects outside of a computer game, and it's been shown to be quite effective in various areas as well. But yeah, I think it was more effective in their study, probably because there was less familiarization. It was a really novel task. It was a completely new game, and even the objectives were less clear. So I think with something like CSGO and flicking, it's, you know, there is a greater component of game knowledge for sure. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure. Come back at me if it doesn't.
Yeah. And another question was, is it proven that, wait a second, is it proven, could neurostimulation be considered a form of esports doping? And is there any ethical concerns or threats to competition from using this?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, definitely. I think it's a form of neuro doping, isn't it? But so is drinking caffeine, which I've just done before this performance. So one is deemed legal, one is deemed illegal at the moment. I think it's up to governing bodies and teams and sports to kind of get their house in order. But yeah, it's an interesting area. There are some ethical concerns around it. Yeah, I think, you know, I think it is up to like a governing body to decide what's permissible or not, because at the moment it's a really gray area in most sports, isn't it? Caffeine allowed to a certain dose, but not other aspects. And there's always people trying to gain advantages. So, you know, where does it stop and where does it start? But I think as a technique, it's perfectly safe, but it does modulate cortical excitability. So it does prime you to learn or refine a skill, and in some aspects quicker.
Okay, thank you. And Brian had another question.
Brian?
Oh yeah. They want me to say this. I just said, like, how many players were rejected from the study because they didn't actually have a brain? Because, you know, anecdotal evidence suggests that many who engage on matchmaking platforms may not have a functional brain. I mean, but no, seriously, what are the implications of this for maybe moving this forward into older people, aging people, Alzheimer's, these sort of progressions, these sort of tests, not even game related, the implications for broader scientific applications that, you know, someone's getting older, like me, 40. I mean, is this sort of stuff can help me in my dotage, which is now?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brian. I think the whole idea of active aging is such a hot topic across so many disciplines, and the idea of brain training is a very real, you know, thing, like taking up a musical instrument or Sudoku or any of those kind of cognitively challenging tasks that people are kind of encouraged to do to keep their brains ticking over a bit more. And I think TDCS, or the equivalent, is just the equivalent of learning a new language or learning a new musical instrument. It's just challenging your brain to, you know, lay down some new connections or increase the connections between particular neurons in a particular way. But it's definitely to be encouraged, because, you know, it's definitely a use it or lose it type of a phenomenon, particularly as we age.
And the other thing is that I gave you some crap about the skill rankings with the study, you know, lower skill.
I put Dylan off as well there, so yeah.
Well, I've been thinking about it, and I think, you know, in broad terms, you're actually quite right. But I was talking to someone who is, you know, high rank, competed at Worlds before and stuff, and I said to him, "Where do you consider the actually cutoff point?" And for the very elite players, and I think your study can show that it's much higher. It's global supreme, or, you know, it's really high up in matchmaking, and then on FACEIT it's like level 8 or 9. So I think that I have to accept that you're right. As a Gold Nova 2 or Gold Nova 1 now, I am in the lower skill brackets, and I think it just to say that, yeah, okay, you're right. I think it does create a good distinction there. I think Gold Nova 4 is where people start to have a lot of game sense and more ability.
You heard it here, folks. Brian and Macaulay said I was right. You all heard it here. Okay, just jot the time and the date down. That's a first, I think, Brian. Yeah, thanks.
I had to test your theory.
Thanks, Brian and Mark. We have another question or two questions in the chat. We will move on with Dada, and then we go on further with Isma and Matthew.
I got. Hello. Hey, Mark. Can you hear me?
Ismail, how you doing? Yep.
Hey, Mark. Thank you. Great stuff you're doing there in at the lab. It's really interesting, and especially showing us these recent findings. I have many questions, but I will try just to go with one or two. So, like we know you use this TDCS device Halo. So I was wondering, what is the reliability and validity of this commercial device, as we know that sometimes when we implement commercial devices, they might not be appealing for scientific uses, but more for commercial use. And the second part of this question will be, so what are your predictions in terms of the transfer of the use of, for example, the training software and as well the TDCS device into, looking into the far transferability of this training?
Yeah, thanks, Ismail. It's a great question. I think because of the FDA approvals process for like Halo and a device such as this, I think the reliability and the validity and the reliability of it is probably governed around not exceeding the milliamps that it's purported to give. So it gives between, they say 2 to 3 milliamps. So they give themselves a 1 milliamp kind of leeway there. But I think on the whole, they probably veer towards less milliamps in terms of voltage than more, because they can't exceed 3. If they do, the FDA will have a major issue with that. So I think they're actually getting probably around the threshold of whether a stim is effective or not. So to actually see effects of TDCS is probably more impressive when you consider that they're probably underdoing the amplitude of the voltage in their devices. In terms of how reliable they are to actually give out voltage, we have, so Halo sent us about 15 of them actually, and 3 or 4 of them did not work consistently. So there was a connectivity issue with the app or with the device itself. But because we had an excess supply, we could use them. So we know when they turn on, we know when they turn off, because we test them beforehand. But like we say, we don't know, we don't have any sort of open source. They would tweak them for us if we wanted to make sure we wanted a particular configuration or a particular setup or timing, because we had a good relationship with Halo at the time, and still do. But yeah, there's definitely questions around some of those topics which you mentioned, which are very pertinent. But I think they're on the lower end, so I think to see effects is probably even more impressive. Then the second question, if I'm right, was implications for using it moving forward. Or come in there again, Ismail, and remind me if you don't mind.
Yeah, I was going more in the direction of the training tool, like for example, the software that you're implementing and developing, and as well the use of TDCS in terms of far transferability. So meaning, okay, how can we assure that this training in this task or in the flicking task is actually kind of reflected in the actual game? So of course, you mentioned some about that, but what would be your expectations for that as well?
Yeah, really interesting. I suppose like we're very interested in the far transferability, and we're very interested in looking at TDCS over a prolonged period, because we know from research on TDCS so far that the more you do it, the more it prolongs and the more it stabilizes. So it makes sense to do it over a number of weeks or a number of months, in fact, just to see what that effect actually is. What's the outer edge of that fact? A lot of people are very lazy towards doing longitudinal research because it's just too much of a pain in the ass. But I think it's really needed for TDCS, because we didn't see these differences with the skilled groups. I think we could tease that out if we did it over a number of weeks for definite. And as I say, the more TDCS you do, the more brain stimulation you get, the more it prolongs, the more it stabilizes. So typically it'll last, the effect of brain stimulation will last for an hour. after getting 20 minutes of stimulation, at least an hour. But if you're doing it regularly, it might last for a lot longer, and it might prolong that, and it might stabilize. So that's definitely worth looking at. In terms of the transferability, that's the big question for us here in the lab, and for yourselves and many other people. Like, just how can training transfer into in-game situations? How can we measure, what are the in-game metrics which are really useful metrics to have, and can we see the improvement? And there's definitely a qualitative element to it as well. So, like, as you know, Ismail, there's definitely an aspect to chatting with the players who have done this training and seeing, do they feel more confident? Do they feel more competent at what they're doing? Because that's a big part of it. It's not just a simple mechanical thing where your mechanics are better and now you're going to be brilliant. There's such a more holistic side of it, that doing the training and maybe followed up with some sort of a coaching element. So, look, guys, you've got this benefit. This should see you do, better things in these type of situations, can maybe lead to a really robust kind of confidence that they might have. And then in terms of TDCS, like, would I recommend, teams to buy themselves TDCS devices and train with it? I think absolutely. Why not? It's perfectly safe. Anything to gain an advantage, I think if it's safe and it's been FDA approved, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. These guys wear headsets anyway for communication purposes. Halo have a good headset that, you can have a microphone in there, you can do all sorts of things in there. So yeah, I'd recommend it, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks.
You can move on, Matthew, with your question.
Great, thanks, Ollie. Hi, Mark. Thanks for the really interesting presentation. I've just been thinking about training approaches, and I was wondering if there might be room in your work or ways to combine things with your work, specifically the idea of task constraints. So are there maybe more approaches to, for example, working with more friction? You mentioned the idea of friction being important for this, the execution of flicking, for example. Could you work with like a weighted mouse, and would you anticipate training developments there? Are there other sort of task constraints you could apply, and have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, we have. Not sure how much I can say about this topic at the moment, because we're doing quite a lot of it with Logitech. We've done a series of, we've done about 18 months of peripherals testing in esports, and obviously everyone says lighter is better, but we're kind of testing that out at the moment, and we're seeing some very exciting results. I'd like to tell you more about it, but we're being recorded.
Okay, thanks. Next time, maybe.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, I think the issue of constraints is a really interesting one, and even looking at DPI and sensitivity and the mouse, that people use, and their perception of the weight of the mouse. There, we see 40-gram mouses out now, as opposed to, your bog standard 80, 90-gram mouses. And, what effect does that have? Is there a fatigue issue when you're using these mice of different weights and so on? And is there an adaptation to changing your mouse, and how long will that take to get to come back into it? We're trying to look at all of these aspects at the moment and just see like how much of a perturbation there is to someone who uses a particular mouse weight, and then what happens when they use something that might be different from that weight, and how long it takes them to get back to a performance level or to augment their performance. Yes, and look, we have some interesting results so far, and we'll definitely love to share them, which is at some point. Or you can email me offline, I'll happily chat to you some more.
Okay, then we move on with another question. I will post it in the chat. In cognitive tests like peripheral vision test, which preceded Playmaster GG, did you find differences between different levels of gamers, and did you publish it anywhere?
Yeah, great question. We didn't publish any of our software tests, even how we developed them at the time, because they were tied in with Logitech, and they were tied in with, intellectual property and all sorts of other issues. And the other issue we had was we were always changing them. So we would go and we would do some testing with TSM or Cloud9, and they would say, this test is okay, but if it had this part in it, it might be better. So we would come back and we would tweak the test. As soon as you tweak the test, you know, you don't have the same test with the same participants. So, you know, we found that we might have had 15 versions of, you know, mouse tracking or flick tests. So which version do you try and publish with, and how many people have you tested with that? So it's a really tough area actually to nail down when you're constantly iterating a software test to be as good as it can be, because you're just in that iteration phase for years. We spent 3 years tweaking those tests, and then Logitech said, I think we've got something here, thanks a million, let's run with this, you know. So we'll definitely try and publish the software development of those tests side of it now, and the data is really messy because we kept changing, tweaking them. So it's pretty hard to publish anything except how you develop them rather than the performance on them. But from people doing them, we could tell we had a priority list of which we thought were the strongest tests, and flicking was definitely up there, as well as strafing for first person shooter type games, and this idea of knowing where your mouse was in space and tracking. So they were the 4 ones for us.
Thank you. And then we go on with Michael Trotter.
G'day. My question was just around transferability between, I suppose, Counter-Strike and maybe other first-person shooters like, I don't know, PUBG or COD or other games that are maybe got a slightly different design, as opposed to, you know, Counter-Strike is very much kind of an invasion game, a game of invasion, whereas you've got other games that aren't necessarily quite the same. Do you see that as being much of an impact, or the transferability of that particular skill and the importance of performance in other games? And actually, I had a second question really quickly. I was really interested to understand, like, did you look at all at what DPI settings that the players kind of came into the study with? Like, did the high level players start with a lower DPI or a higher DPI, or?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for those questions. We looked at DPI. I think I had a slide there. I'll share these slides with Ollie. He can send them around maybe or whatever. But their DPI didn't change over the course of the 8 days, Michael. So what they came in with, they stuck with for the same over the 8 days. The elite guys had a very low DPI. I think it was 750 was the average. Lower skilled had something a little higher. I think it was 1,000 or 1,100, and the others had a really high, ridiculous one, which was terrible for shooting. But they didn't change either, because that's what they were used to. So they would do a familiarization with the task, and they would select their DPI. So we opened up the Logitech software. We're using Logitech mouse, so they would tweak around with that. We would record that, but it didn't change over the study. So that answers your second question. Your first question then was around transferability to other games. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's why we set out in the first place to have like non-gaming software gaming tests, if you know what I mean. That we wanted them independent of a game, because, you know, you talk to any CSGO player, they will tell you that the in-game sensitivity is different in CSGO to Fortnite to, you know, PUBG to something else. So it's like, how, you know, it's like giving a golfer a slightly different golf club and expecting them to be like, yeah, this is grand, this is going to make me a better this type of golfer. It's very, very tricky to do. So I think, you know, outside of having particular tests, so like we modified our tests and we put them into the CSGO architecture, relatively straightforward. You know, with other tests it might be a little harder to incorporate them into the CSGO architecture or into the other game architecture, or there might be proprietary stuff going on there as well. So it's hard to know just how that would go, you know. But I think something like flicking is probably a robust enough skill to transfer over, even if the sensitivity issues are there. But I think there would be some transferability issues, but I think it would make for probably a great series of studies to do.
Cool. Thanks very much. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. We have another question. Did you have Wolf's support at all through this and the test integration?
I know.
Okay. Thanks.
Easy answer.
I've got a question, Mark. So if we look at the esports market now, we look at gaming, right? Gaming revenues are 50% mobile, but the biggest development in esports is going to be mobile. And then as a person who is in the PlayStation nation, Ireland, as we call ourselves, and I'm in Sweden, and I know the difference between PC gaming and console gaming in the different countries. You know, a lot of people here, Michael's in Australia, he's probably seen different aspects as well of cultures and stuff. So we have this console increase and we have this mobile increase. And the idea of the question is where can you go with this beyond the mouse and keyboard and the PC master race people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know actually, because yeah, like you say, e-sport in general or gaming in general is heading into this kind of mobile sphere, but I think it'll be a bit like traditional sports. You'll have your pure e-sport, which will be your PC CSGO type of a tournament in a venue or in a stadium or in wherever. I think that is probably that's probably going to be the case for those kind of locked in esports, and it'll be like, you know, the old versus the new, and you know, it'll be that kind of typical type of a setup. But in terms of, you know, how do we test and measure gaming skills on mobile devices and so on, that's a whole new challenge, isn't it? You know, because even screen size, whether they're using their finger versus whether they're using, you know, some other type of an implement. I mean, it's just a whole new level of intricacy in terms of what you need to do there. So that would be a completely new deriving and evaluating key performance indicators in mobile devices for esports project, I think.
Yeah, and also, you know, the first thing I heard from someone senior DreamHack here was that you have to watch the kids on the phones. He said they do things we can't do. So as we struggle to unlock it, I mean, I still struggle getting the YouTube screen back off it. That the younger generation are smartphone natives that have, you know, like almost magical powers compared to us. I mean, so what about research with schools and kids? I mean, how challenging is something like that for LERO to work with children? Because, you know, in Australia, it was pretty much felt like you were asking something dodgy if you wanted to even have under 18s answer a survey. So what are the challenges for LERO and your lab to actually work with schools and younger generations that are the future?
Yeah, we've avoided it like the plague so far, to be honest, Brian, because it's just easier to test young adults. We're based in a university, so we have a pretty good supply we've got 16,000 students, many of whom are gamers. So we've had this easy supply of young adults. But obviously, if we want to broaden out our research, you know, we've run outreach days where we've had kids in and they played on the computers. We've done a little presentation for them, but the teacher will be there and child protection guidelines and all that. If I want to run a study with under 18s at the moment, I have to get guarded clearance. I have to go through about 10 extra hoops in terms of ethics, applications, and so on. And I have to, you know, I have to justify everything that I'm doing, you know, to the nth degree. It's quite restrictive, and I've just avoided it so far, but it is something that will need to be done down the line.
So whoever's prepared to go through the bureaucracy and the police checks and the days and days of ethics applications, there is an opportunity there. And I agree with you, it won't be me.
Yeah, exactly. It's just such a constraint. It kind of, you know, it does put you off. But I mean, like the big area to look at logically is probably developmental skills for esports. So it's probably, you know, 13, 14, 15-year-olds as they're getting into gaming or into, you know, maybe more serious gaming where they're actually trying to improve their skills now and their rankings are starting to matter and so on. That's probably a really critical period to intervene on, to give them some sort of interventions or protocols or coaching or training or whatever that might be. So, you know, it makes perfect sense to do that. It's just the thoughts of it at the moment are just a little bit off-putting, but I think we will have to do it, bite the bullet and do something developmental over the next year or two.
Thanks. It's quite interesting to get your insights. And the next question is from Mike.
Hey, sorry, I just had a really quick follow-up question. I had a bit of think about what you're saying about the fact that each different game has got like different like a feel to it, a little bit like the different golf clubs you're saying. I'd heard Shroud say once that one of the things that made him so successful was his ability to really quickly adapt to new games. And I just wondered with the previous question about DPI, whether or not I don't know whether you'd know this, whether you've had a look at this in any capacity, but is there any difference between like the high level players and lower skill players and how quickly they can adapt to DPI? Because there are certain games like Escape from Tarkov, for example, where every single weapon has a different kind of speed for rotating the mouse. And so depending on what weapon the player carries depends on kind of essentially how quickly that flick speed can occur. And I wonder whether as games progress, that will become a more regular feature in games. And I just wonder whether or not you knew whether higher skill players were better at being able to adapt to the change in DPI or flick speed as opposed to lower level players.
I suspect they would be. I suspect they'd have a much better motor repertoire for dampening or for easing off and things, or for even noticing what's happening with their, their kind of interaction with the mouse. But we haven't looked at it. We've actually approached it from the other side, Michael. We developed a dynamic DPI test. So we developed a DPI setting which would adjust based on how you're doing in a task, but it would do it for you automatically. So, if you were a gamer, you might find it very frustrating because it would show that you are undershooting and it would increase your DPI. It would show that you're overshooting and it would decrease your DPI. And we thought it'd be really nice to see, could we develop a dynamic DPI which changes based on the task you're doing? In other words, if you are running between, different events, do you need a certain DPI? And then when you pull out a certain gun, do you to do a certain type of a task, do you need a different DPI? So we went down the road of developing a dynamic DPI test, but it's not a finished product by any means, but it's something we're particularly interested in because I think there is that interplay between adaptation and what the finished product looks like, and then what the actual person does. What's the interaction in the meantime between the two?
Cool, excellent, thanks. I got to run, but there's been a fantastic presentation. Really interested to follow your work. Thanks very much,
Michael.
Thanks for joining, Mike. I have another question. How do you think can the results of your studies be applied or transferred to traditional sports? Is there any way that they can benefit all these results?
Yeah, I think so. I think, we've shown that as little as 10 minutes of training per day on a particular technical task can be beneficial. 30 minutes of this task can be beneficial for lower skilled and novice gamers. So, I think it's worth trying to see, can we do 10 to 15 minutes of a particular type of training for mainstream sports? And will that be as beneficial or as effective over those 30, 40, 50 minutes, 3-4 days type of a thing? There is some evidence out there for different things, but I think it's probably maybe the same sort of protocol or the same procedure could be used, that we've developed. It could be used in different esports or in different sports.
Thank you. I'm just curious if there an attempt to do this with exergaming or active video gaming, similar approach?
Yeah, we haven't gone down the exergaming route, apart from just looking at the effect of exercise on cognition, which is an exergaming, but we haven't looked at that area yet. It's a whole area in and of itself, and it's just not one we've explored.
Okay, thanks. Are there any further questions? Brian?
I mean, the whole haptic thing, when you're saying the exergaming, I'm just like, can you please develop some sort of online fighting game where we wear haptic vests and we can have an old punching game with our friends across the world as a bit of exercise? I mean, that to me, that's the dream. Have Mortal Kombat in your living room while getting fit, and you can adjust the pain of the haptic vest. And I mean, is that something that the lab could do in the future? Is that like, get the broader VR stuff, the haptic vest? Is the technology going to come for the really cool stuff?
Yeah, we've ordered 2 VR systems actually to come in. We're looking at a bit of a sneak peek. We're moving into simulated driving next. So we're going to have a driving lab as well. Obviously haptics are going to play a bigger role there, but we've talked about haptics before with Logitech a lot, and about the design of the mouse and like what kind of haptics you could have there. Like we mentioned friction and force control and click force and all these other things earlier. But you know, your hand gets sweaty when you're competing. Like, could you have a mouse which cools down or heats up, or, you know, what are the other things which you could do with some of the peripherals you have? And like, there's a lot of, it's really, you know, sci-fi kind of sphere, but I think there's definitely worth exploring. And for us, we're definitely going to do it in terms of sim driving next, just to see, because, you know, there's lots of possibilities there with pedals and steering wheels and so on, but there's more of a haptic issue there if you want to make it more kind of feel more real, you know. But I think the same can be applied to lots of other sports.
I'm looking forward to it, and now I'm looking forward to Dylan's question or feedback.
Don't get too excited. Mark, great presentation. Thank you so much. My question kind of builds on what, you know, a limitation of the studies that you brought up, and what Isma kind of asked already in terms of transferability. I think some kind of ecological learning design people would say that if you're training as, you know, flicking in a block way outside of the actual game, transferability could be impacted. And obviously there's that big argument going on between those two fields at the moment. And you've already commented on that. My question was going to be more about, and you've commented on this already as well, on how we measure performance in esports and how we'd actually measure an in-game increase in performance. A bit of advice I would seek from you is that we're seeking to do some kind of intervention, some kind of coping intervention from a psychological standpoint. And outside of having a control group that don't receive the intervention, which you could obviously do with your kind of flick training and other things with Playmaster GG. And then outside of a subjective measure of performance, did you feel this improved your performance, or do you think you play better now having done our training? Do you have any advice on where you see the future of measuring in-game performance going, and how we might actually objectively measure an improvement in in-game performance outside of kill to death ratio?
Yeah, I think CSGO had an initiative recently where they had more metrics, didn't they? I forget what it was called, but they gave you more metrics as part of the package. You know, you have to pay for it, and then they released it for free. I waited till it came out for free, but I did enjoy that. It would give you your percentage of damage that you were doing, rather than, you know, whether your kills versus your deaths.
Broken Fang.
Open Fang. Thanks, Brian.
Broken Fang.
Broken Fang. Yeah. So like that was kind of interesting. But like what we try and do in the lab here, Dylan, as well, as we have lab Steam accounts on each machine. So when we get people in, instead of them signing into their Steam account, if they're doing a training or whatever, they can sign into our lab Steam account, which is set up to a particular way. The matchmaking is at a particular level and so on. So it's not like, you know, if they improve, their matchmaking improves and so on. We can kind of control for that in a lab type of a situation a little bit if we had multiple Steam accounts and we knew which rankings were which. That's definitely worth playing around with. But it's just such a challenge. And I think, you know, the gaming companies can be very quiet in terms of giving you any information or steer on any of their kind of metrics, but you can be sure that they have them, you know. But what we do is we scrape the Steam account, we take all the stats out of it, we look at time they've played, ammo, shots, etc. But you know, there's probably more to be done there. But controlling for Steam accounts and not signing into their own account might be a useful strategy for yourself.
Awesome, thanks.
Are there any questions left that you want to ask? Then this is your chance now.
Mark, what rank are you in CSGO?
I'm very proud silver too, Brian. Low skill.
Yeah, that's all. I just wanted him to admit it. If I'm low skill, he's lower skilled.
I'm sorry, I have one last question. How, because it seems like you really found a really good way to be funded and to be supported by organizations and by Logitech and maybe other places, right? So how have you found around, I guess, in the UK or in Ireland, especially, this support towards funding esports or esports lab, esports research? Because I feel like there is still some sort of obstacles and sort of, you know, is esports sport is accepted? Should we put money into research in esports? So how did you go like to break that, let's say, stereotype, or how have you seen the development over the years since you've been funded already for a long time, for those who might be interested in start looking for funds more at the holistic level?
Yeah, it's really hard. I think it's still a challenge. I think when people see sport in any grant application, they just it's a no-no, it's a turn off. And I think when you put E in front of it, they just go, what's this? I think it is really challenging to get funded for esports research. And I think if you have a look at some of the people who have been successful for funding, they've almost disguised the gaming and the esports side of it behind, brain stuff or cognitive stuff or whatever. Like they've almost done that 180. But we've applied for plenty of external grants, and a lot of them come back and just like, esports, it's not something we're interested in or whatever. It's a real no-no. But like, we're lucky here because we're attached to a software research center, and once we develop software or have a software angle, that gives us a bit more credibility in terms of what it is we're trying to do, because not only are we researching performance in esport, but we're also looking to develop software or systems around it. So that's kind of been useful for us in some ways. But and Science Foundation Ireland have been quite supportive of that, because they see the growth of esport. They see that it's a really profitable area that's exponentially growing, and it has this kind of cultural impact. So I guess it's trying to get across the worth of doing the research, and saying things like, it hasn't been done before, just doesn't cut it anymore. You almost need this really convincing argument as to why this research needs to be done. And it can't be because it hasn't been done in esport, or because esports is the Wild West and there's nothing being done with it. That just no funding agency will want that. You need a kind of a really compelling argument for that, and maybe tying it in with tying a part of your project in with active aging, or something along those lines might be the way to go. Even if it isn't the total focus of it, it's almost like it's not a smoke and mirrors, but it's almost a little bit. You almost need to think about the implications. It's like some of the questions today, it's almost like, this is interesting, but what if this was used here? I think we probably need to think about that just to gain funding. But I think using the word esport is probably a no-no in a grant application at the moment. It probably needs to be gaming, computer gaming, or something along those lines, because I think sport just puts people off, and I hate that. It's depressing.
Yeah, and just to step in here, that the Esports Research Network, of course, you can always work with us. We're happy to support people. We have the Discord, and like literally, and not enough people are taking us up on this support. And the multidisciplinary is another thing. I think, Mark, what you say is right, that when you've got the different aspects of things, the business, the health, the education, all those things. So like, I'm just saying that we're here to support people, and nobody ever asks us to speak and connect people. So please do contact us there as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, look, a colloquium such as this and the Esports Research Network, which is looking at European funding or looking at setting up clusters and kind of broader collaborative things, that's the way to go. Because if we can organize ourselves as a large collective of esports researchers who are doing all of these different areas, then we can have our training networks versus our bigger grants, multidisciplinary sites, replications, all these kind of open science, good science initiatives can be done there. And like, if we want to be successful, it probably is as a group and not just individual little groups here, there, and everywhere. I think to get some big funding, it's probably an esports research network, a grouping of 10 research groups together, putting in something which is really robust and tackles esports from 20 different sides, is probably the way this is going to happen, I'd say. And I'd be very interested in supporting initiatives like that, with Brian and ERN and all that.
Thank you, Mark. Is there anything you want to add before I'm going to close the colloquium for today?
No, it's great to be here, and thanks everyone for your participation. It's been a really useful chat. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you. Then I just want to echo in the end that what Phil typed in the chat. He said, "Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Your research lab and team is very impressive. I'm looking forward to hearing or reading more from your research." The next eSport colloquium will take place on June 16th with, oh, it's a private message. I posted in the chat, with Guillermo Mendoza, and he will talk about his research addressing mental performance in esports. And if you want to stay updated, you can also check my Twitter account. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. I had a great time. It was nice seeing you all, and it was great listening to your presentation, Mark. And feel free to contact Mark for further collaborations.
Great. Thanks, Ali. Thanks, guys.
Have a nice day.
Bye.